Hey, what's up? Today I wanted to go over my portfolio update, and I've been doing that over the last couple of months. If you want to check it out, you could check out the playlist on my channel. But the reason why I'm doing this is to kind of show you like the behind the scenes of yield farming, right? Sometimes it's not going to look pretty and it's not really that easy either if you are basically providing liquidity for higher risk assets. Sometimes drawdowns could be pretty aggressive and sometimes we do make like stupid mistakes or unexpected losses, right? For example, in September, I had a pretty big loss from like a social engineering scam, but I've already made a video on it, so I won't dive too much into that. And in this video, I want to kind of go over like a few different positions, my reasoning behind yield farming these positions, my overall strategy to finish off the year and heading into next year. And I'll also share a few tips that I've learned, so hopefully you could make more money from providing liquidity and avoid some of the mistakes I've made. So if you're new here, my name is Richard. I'm a yield farmer and a DeFi investor. And I really like yield farming concentrated liquidity pools because it's a great way to earn high yield on your assets that you want to invest in anyway. And it's a great way to build up your portfolio. So let's dive right in here. If you look at my portfolio trend, I've been doing pretty well earlier on in the year. My main goal from like February to May was to kind of accumulate more Ethereum when prices were pretty cheap. So I did that with just like mainly the fees and providing liquidity for different altcoins. And I did close a bunch of positions in Ethereum profit when I was yield farming those altcoins, right? So earlier on, it was pretty good. And as Ethereum price went up in the last couple of months, you will see that my Ethereum balance kind of declined. The reason why is mainly because I was starting to realize some profits into US dollar, right? So that is like a de-risking strategy that I implement when it comes to providing liquidity. I started using more like crypto to stable pairs like Ethereum to USDC. And that is typically a good thing to do if prices are getting more and more expensive, right? You don't really want to have too much altcoins if prices are kind of drifting up. But then in September and October, we did see a pretty big drawdown on a lot of these altcoins. And I did lose about 76K from like a social engineering scam. So if I didn't actually have this scam, my portfolio would be at around like 240, 250K right now, right? So it would not look as bad as it is right now, but I can't really go back in time and fix that mistakes, right? So I gotta kind of just deal with it and slowly build up my portfolio from now on. And it's kind of like a new reset, right? So I gotta get used to my current portfolio, slowly build that up and not take too much risk to try to build my capital back up very rapidly, right? Because sometimes if we make a pretty big loss, it's tempting to just like go all in like one investment or something. And then potentially you could lose even more money if you're not making good decisions. But early on, up until August, I was able to like outperform Bitcoin. And that's ideally my goal for the long term. I want to be stacking more and more Bitcoin, and hopefully it does outperform Ethereum, Solana, and stablecoins as well. So this year, because of the scam, has been kind of flat, as well as the weaker altcoin market. So that is completely normal, right? If the underlying assets that you're yield farming doesn't do that well, then it's very likely that your portfolio is going to be down. But that doesn't mean that you're realizing that loss, right? Investing is more of a longer term game. So I'm not trying to like make a big amount of profits like month over month. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm accumulating the assets that I want to hold and that I'm betting on assets that are likely to move up in price over the next 6 to 12 months if I'm like more actively investing, or on a longer time frame like stuff like Bitcoin and Ethereum, I'm slowly building up those allocations, right? And that's typically the strategy that I recommend like my clients and my students. If you guys are providing liquidity, one of your main goals should be to stack more Bitcoin and more Ethereum, simply because these assets are likely to be around for a long time compared to some of these other more speculative investments, right? And you could consider like stacking Solana and Hype as well. But yeah, that's kind of like my overall performance. And of course, if some of these altcoins turn around, one of my largest holding is Pixel. We could dive deeper into the holdings here. Basically, if my underlying assets do perform really well, then my portfolio would do really well, right? There's a couple catalysts that is coming up for Pixel, hopefully end of the year or like the beginning of Q1. So hopefully my portfolio would kind of catch up and then do really well. And of course, my portfolio is going to be different from yours. My portfolio is considered like a higher risk, higher reward investment portfolio, simply because I don't put everything I have into crypto. I've already de-risked a bunch of my earnings into like traditional finance investment or into cash. And I'm holding a bunch of cash on the sidelines as well. If the market crashes, that's when I would be taking advantage of the cheaper price, right? And I'm already exposed to like a lot of altcoins. So even though if you look at the others chart, which is made up of mostly altcoins, even though the prices are kind of down a decent amount from the high, it's not really cheap enough for me to be like aggressively adding to my bags because I already have a bunch of altcoins, right? But if I do see like a huge dump on Ethereum, for example, or on Bitcoin, I would be buying much more aggressively and hopefully increase my portfolio by quite a lot. So that's kind of like my overall view of my portfolio. And you can see here the Bitcoin amount is at 0.084. In September, it's at 0.076, right? And what I really like to do as well is to keep this DCA log. So this is another strategy that you guys can run when you're providing liquidity. You could use a portion of the fees that you generate to just buy some Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin, again, is the largest crypto and it's the safest investment in like crypto. And we've seen with alts this cycle, alts just have been like dragging behind quite heavily. So we never know what's going to happen in the future, right? Maybe alts will go down more, but maybe if the rates come down and then there's a lot of speculation in the market, alts would go up by quite a lot, right? Like with the meme coin mania, a lot of alts actually pulled quite a great return. So I was able to make a pretty decent profit last year from alts, but we gotta kind of like diversify and spread out our risk a little bit. If you guys are yield farming a ton of alts, it's always helpful, in my opinion, to kind of like balance out your portfolio by buying some Bitcoin, right? So this is exactly what I've been doing. And in January, you can see I barely had any Bitcoin, only like $1,000 something worth of Bitcoin. So 0.0167. And then by October, slowly adding to my bag, I'm now at 0.084, right? So if I get to like zero point 0.1 and then like slowly to 0.2, eventually I would be able to stack one whole Bitcoin, right? And then if there's a lot of gains that I'm making in the next couple of months, I would be adding to my Bitcoin bag as well and my stablecoin bag, simply because I want to de-risk a little bit as I go along, the longer this bull market lasts, right? But yeah, that's something to understand when you guys provide liquidity. You want to make sure that you pick assets that you're comfortable accumulating, or at least assets that you're not willing to sell if the price drop, right? So we got to pick assets that we actually believe in. For me right now, it's mainly Pixel, Ethereum, Bitcoin, and then some Hype, Pendle, and Pump. So those are like my main core holdings besides Pixel. But again, I am a pretty heavy investor in Pixel. I did get in at a cheaper price. And I did get some of it free from staking my Sappy Seals NFT as well. So that's why I do have a bigger allocation to Pixel. And Pixel has actually been one of my best LPs I had this year, simply because I've been providing liquidity for it since like the end of 2023. And then the fees was quite great as well because it's a lower cap token and it's a higher yield, right? So I've been able to basically accumulate more Pixel as well as diversify my holdings a bit while yield farming this Pixel. But again, my portfolio right now is pretty high risk, a bit more risk than what I would normally like, simply because in September, I did lose that huge chunk from the social engineering scam, right? If you look at like my August portfolio, I did have a pretty huge chunk of my portfolio in an ETH to USDC pool. This is typically what I recommend most investors to do. And again, none of this is meant to be financial advice. I'm just sharing like what has worked well for me and my clients. And hopefully you pick a strategy that is more suitable for you, right? But basically, if we have like a blue chip cushion, a big altcoin dump is not going to affect us as much mentally, and then we could make better investment decisions, right? And typically, if you take on too much risk, you could lose a ton of money as well if your thesis doesn't really play out as you planned, right? But it was pretty painful to lose this core E to USDC position. But that's not a big deal because I will be building up my allocation slowly. I've been accumulating cash on the side from like my normal day job, investment consulting, or from building Drippy Finance. I am reinvesting a lot of the income from Drippy Finance, but I am also stacking some profits I've made in cash so that in case there's a pretty good buying opportunity, I want to take advantage of that, right? But yeah, I do expect that if Pixel goes well, the potential upside could be at least like 10 to 20x, right? It's really hard to tell. And I am getting like a Monad airdrop thanks to the Sappy Seals NFT. So hopefully by launch date, that's a pretty decent amount. So it's probably at least another $5,000 to $10,000 that is added to my portfolio with that airdrop. And that's something that you guys can do as well, right? You could be yield farming protocols or interacting with like different protocols, either through socials or with actual money to try to get some airdrops. And you can see some of these pools here, like the hype to USDT pool or the pump to hype pool. I am providing on Project X and they do have a points program. So if you guys want to sign up for that, you can. Feel free to use my referral code as well to get like a point boost. It's basically my social handle at Richard and Sue. So you will get some point boost here and hopefully it gives us some pretty nice airdrop. But that basically is my overall current portfolio. And if we go to my liquidity pool tracking sheet, you will notice that I did close some positions at a loss like this pump to USDC. I lost about $543 because I wanted to kind of de-risk a little bit and then kind of pivot to this hype to USDT zero because I was a little bit concerned about like that dump in October 10th. Maybe there's some like fallout or some funds that went bankrupt that we didn't really know about, right? So I was kind of being a little bit more careful and was a little bit worried about like my pump and hype pool being converted fully to pump, right? So I do want some hype exposure. That's why I did close this position that was sitting in like a slight loss, 500 something dollars loss once you account for the fees and stuff like that into this hype and USDT pool on Project X because I believe if there's a pretty brutal drawdown, hype would probably hold up pretty well. And that's why I pivoted. And these pools are sitting in profit right now. If we look at like the tracker on Metrics Finance, I did lose about 500 something dollars from that pump pool, right? But this hype pool is sitting in nice profit. So that capital is in pretty good profit. But yeah, if you guys are providing liquidity, one thing we have to keep in mind is that if the underlying asset don't do that well, like for example, both hype and pump kind of retrace a little bit, you will be sitting in some US dollar unrealized loss, right? But at least it's outperforming holding. So if you're buying the assets anyway, then it is much better to provide liquidity in a lot of cases, or you could run both strategies at the same time, right? You could be holding some spot bag and providing liquidity because sometimes if the price drop like too aggressively or if the price move up too aggressively in like a short amount of time, spot holding typically would outperform liquidity providing. But the problem is you can't really predict like the volatility of these assets, right? Some of these assets move sideways for a very long time or trend down for a very long time and then suddenly it moves upwards, right? Very recently, we see like different assets like virtual on base kind of trend down for quite a long time, like for a few months. So it would have been a pretty painful hold until a catalyst hit that kind of send the price upward. But hopefully this is a chart that happens in your holdings and in my holdings as well. So it's not a good idea to kind of like try to time the market too much or try to squeeze the range too much. So that's why I say it all the time in my videos. Typically wider ranges do outperform tighter ranges on like longer time span because you never know when the aggressive price movement would come, right? And if your ranges are too tight, you're going to be knocked out of range really quickly, either to the downside or to the upside. So you're not going to be earning any fees, and your actual APR and the profit and loss could be actually much less than like a wider range strategy. So that's kind of my overall profit and loss. And again, I am still in pretty good profit on like a lot of these investments. My positions are still outperforming holding mostly. And sometimes my goal is to make a net profit and not really worry about like the performing against holding that much, right? For example, some of these pools are basically in a loss, it outperforms holding. That's not really what I'm trying to do in a lot of cases. Like for example, these ETH to USDC pool, sometimes it does underperform holding, but my goal in some of these cases is to lock in a US dollar profit, right? That's why I designed this tracking sheet. You could use it to fit your goals. And my goals, again, very long term, is to basically stack more Bitcoin, more Ethereum, and more stable coins. If you stack those three assets, I believe that, you would make more money over time, right? Rather than lose money over time. But October, in terms of fees, hasn't been that great because a lot of pools did get knocked out of range because a lot of the altcoins are quite weak relative to Ethereum and also in like US dollar terms, right? So the fees dropped a little bit, but not too big of a deal because if I believe that these assets would recover in price or it would pop back in range, then I would be earning more fees in the process, right? If not, then I might choose to realize some losses like the MOG pool. Like MOG has had like a pretty big drawdown. If I want to sell and like rotate to other assets, I could do that at any time, right? But I'm still holding on a little bit just because I want some meme coin exposure just in case the market recovers, right? But this is completely normal if you guys are yield farming, especially if you don't have like a blue chip allocation. Your fees might fluctuate pretty wildly depending on the ranges that you set, right? And even sometimes like I do set pretty wide ranges. Some of my pools do get knocked out of range. So you never know like what the price is going to do. That's why I always say, it's always safer to go like wider rather than tighter. Maybe the fees you generate might not be as much, but it is much less risk than like, going too tight, right? Especially in a market that is quite weak. We do really kind of want to be a little bit more careful. And that's also another reason why I'm not heavily buying alts at these levels because the win rate just simply don't seem very high. Of course, we do see some like outperformers like the virtual as well as Arrow that is looking pretty decent. Probably people like speculating on the base airdrop, right? But I'm happy with my altcoin exposure, so I'm not going to kind of like chase these assets too much unless maybe like if these assets go on like a deep sale, right? And that's the reality of providing liquidity for altcoins is that sometimes, your portfolio is just going to not look as pretty if the prices are not trending up, right? And again, you got to be comfortable with the assets that you are providing liquidity for. Like for Pixel, for example, I am comfortable with this asset. I do have like a more conservative profit target with some of my shorter term holdings and to just de-risk in general. But if you guys scroll through like a list of, let's say 20 to 50 altcoins, something like AVAX or even SUI, right? The chart has just been quite weak compared to like 2024. So it's completely normal to see like a more flat performance on your portfolio, especially if you have like larger allocation to these altcoins. So basically that's my overall portfolio, but my main goal pretty much stays the same. The first is to stack more Bitcoin, more Ethereum, and more stable coins with the fees. I already have a pretty good allocation to Ethereum, so I'm more focused on stacking Bitcoin and stablecoins. My second goal is to take some profits on some of these altcoins if the profit taking opportunity comes. For example, I am keeping a close eye on this ETH to others chart. So if a lot of other altcoins are outperforming Ethereum, there's probably some really nice profit taking opportunity to close my position in an ETH profit, right? For example, if this chart drops pretty aggressively, like what it did in the last bull market, it means that a lot of altcoins are pumping against Ethereum. And then if I am an Ethereum bull, I can close a lot of these positions in ETH profit. And let's just say I start with 10 ETH. I could close my positions for, let's say, 15 ETH or 20 ETH. And then I could use that extra ETH to either convert to Bitcoin, to stable coins, or to just hold on to my ETH, right? So that's kind of like my overall strategy. I'm waiting for a lot of these alts to outperform. If it doesn't, these are the alts that I am comfortable holding anyway into like the bear market. So that's not a big deal, right? Stuff like Pixel, Hype, Candle, Pump. I'm comfortable with these assets, but you got to decide which assets that you're comfortable holding on as well. And I've seen a lot of people that just yield farm with some stable coins or farm airdrops with stable coins. That's also another strategy that you could consider. I personally like to have like a long market bias, especially when the prices are cheap, because I could hold through the drawdown and I already have cash on the sides and like in other investments that I could pull to allocate to crypto if I really need to. So hopefully that makes sense, guys. I'm just sitting on my hands mostly for now. But yeah, like the big loss was pretty bad back in September. It's kind of like you're playing poker, right? And then maybe you had a decent hand, like a king and a five, but then suddenly someone stole like your king away from you. So then you're left with a five, right? Of course, it's not like the worst card. It's not like a two, but like a five is not that great either, right? So my portfolio is a little bit more challenging to work with because of that loss, but I do have client portfolios that have done quite well simply because they didn't have that loss and they're running strategies that are more sustainable, like what I teach you guys on this channel, right? So if you do want to learn more about yield farming, how to do it sustainably, how to do it safely, and how to do it passively as well, then be sure to check out the other videos on my channel. I do put a lot of thought into like my strategies, so hopefully it helps you form your own strategies and help you make more money in the process. And one really nice thing about more sustainable strategies is that you don't really have to spend that much time to manage your positions, right? Before filming this video, I actually just claimed and harvested my fees. It took me only about like 1 to 2 hours to kind of plan everything out, to track everything, even with like a more complete Excel tracking sheet, right? So it's a much better return on my time compared to maybe some more like short-term strategies, like you're trying to squeeze a range and then maybe you're knocked out of range all the time. And then you're also maybe forced to realize some losses if you get caught in a big dump, right? So that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you once again for watching. I'll catch you next time.